Thank you, Rabbi Davidson, for this great introduction. I'd like to wish you and the entire congregation Shana Tova and Gmar Chatima Tova from Jerusalem. This is also an opportunity for me to express gratitude to the wonderful Gadi Levi and his entire staff for being so efficient and effective delivering content and enriching your lives at Congregation Emanu. As you probably know, some of you do know, the name of your congregation, Emanu, runs in my family. My great-grandfather, who came to Jerusalem in 1874, his name was Emanuel Aronoff. My father was named Emanuel Aronoff, my late father. And my son's middle name is also Emmanuel. So, it means God is with us, not just as an insurance policy, but also as a force that is pushing us to more and more tikkun olam. That's my message to you by way of the Torah portion of the week. I am delighted to bring you an update from Israel. And as you probably all know, the new year begins with a great promise. We have had several very difficult years, not only because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but mostly because of the what seemed to be imminent instability of Israel's political system. We had a political indecision after 4 attempts, 4 national election cycles that ended with a new government that surprisingly is working in harmony. We'll be talking about that. We're on the verge of passing a budget, the first budget in 3.5 years. In Israel, you must know, the budget is a bill. It's a piece of legislation, and the government cannot govern without this main instrument, this main economic tool that sets priorities, that allows the government to execute its own policy. When there is no budget, it's impossible to function, and we have been functioning without a national budget for 3 years now. So Israel's democracy, despite of the opinions and the assessments of many commentators, proved to be not only resilient, but actually very, very, very robust. Israeli democracy survived and is looking more robust than ever. And the question that we ask ourselves is, what is the explanation to this seemingly improbable resilience and survivability of Israeli democracy? How can Israel maintain a multi-party system, an open and vibrant debate between those parties, and a pluralistic political representation? A piece of history. Post-World War II, 130 new countries were created. Most of them were established with aspirations to be democratic, or at least to be somewhat pluralistic, but by the same token, most of them imploded into authoritarian regimes or a one-party system, especially countries in the eastern part of Europe. And Israel's democracy is a unique phenomenon because it faced unprecedented external and internal pressures, and because it is uncharacteristic to this region. And there are several explanations, and I think they're very relevant to our update today. The first is that the pioneers that came, the newcomers that came to the land of Israel, late 19th century, 20th century, they came from countries that had a democratic tradition. But the truth is that the pioneers did not come from countries with a democratic tradition. They came from Tsarist Russia, they came from Poland that was authoritarian, they came from Romania that was authoritarian. Those who came in the early 1930s, late 1920s came from Germany, which was already under the Nazis by the early 1930s. So the idea that Israeli democracy's origin come from the democratic tradition doesn't hold. The second explanation that most people give is that the idea of democracy comes in the Bible. Well, that's also very difficult to find evidence in the Bible for what we would describe today as representative democracy or elective representation. The Bible gave the world great universalist values. I don't have to tell this congregation, as well as the Talmud and the Mishnah, but there is no evidence of elected regimes in the Bible. Now, a famous Israeli political scientist, Shlomo Avineri, whom I greatly admire, claims that the real explanation has a lot to do with what you're doing day in and day out, with what you're doing at the congregation Emanu, with what you're doing at the Stryker Center under the leadership of Rabbi Davidson and under the leadership of Gadi Levi and his great staff. Professor Avineri claims that Jewish communal life in the diaspora is the most valid explanation to the understanding of the robust nature of Israel's democracy. And how so? Since the destruction of the Second Temple, life in the diaspora were without sovereignty or without military, and the political power that was exerted by Jewish communities was very, very limited. But to maintain their identity, the Jews created voluntary community institutions to provide the needs of the community, from education to welfare. Since those institutions were based on voluntarism, a tradition of elected leadership developed. Some leaders stepped up. Some leaders were, as we say, were self-ordained in the absence of others getting involved. But the principles were of representative democracy, although, of course, it wasn't perfect. But these are the real origins of Israel's robust democracy. When you look at Israeli democracy, when you look at the structure, the three branches, the executive branch, the judicial branch, the legislative branch, it looks like very much the three branches of the American system. But Israel's democracy is fundamentally different than the American system. In what way? The first is, in Israel we don't have constitution, rather we have a set of basic laws. That was a decision made by the first Knesset in 1949. More importantly, unlike the United States, in Israel there is no separation between religion and state. But most interestingly, and I hear it time and again from people that are asking me questions about the Prime Minister, about the former Prime Minister Netanyahu, about the current Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, it's very important to understand, in Israel, the Prime Minister is not the Commander-in-Chief. The Prime Minister is not the Diplomat-in-Chief. Those powers in Israel are being given to the government, to the cabinet. The Prime Minister in Israel holds no presidential powers whatsoever, with the exception of running the Mossad and the Secret Service directly. These are the only two organizations under his direct command. But he's not the commander of the army. He's not the chief diplomat. And the task of governing Israel is a highly complex task of constantly negotiating and building political partnerships and political coalitions. And that requires a great skill in the art of politics. Israel, unlike the United States, is attracting political parties to the center. So we have in Israel a viable political center, which we cannot say about what is happening in the United States, where the gravitation today is towards the extremes. And of course, on a scale of religiosity, when you look at Israeli society, despite of all the attention that the ultra-Orthodox are attracting, I think it would be safe to say that Israeli society, by and large, is more secular on a scale of religiosity than the American society. The current coalition, surprisingly, is pretty stable. People say, well, it's only a majority of one, but they don't bring into account the fact that the Arab parties have no other option. The left wing has no other option. What puts them together is the fact that they have no other option. Israeli democracy survived an unprecedented onslaught on Israel's constitutionalism. If people will ask me what was the main reason for Netanyahu's ouster, I would say Netanyahu was ousted for waging war on Israeli constitutionalism. As you probably all know, there were various attempts to write a constitution for Israel, but instead, what happened was a system of basic laws and rights evolved instead. But Ben Gurion had to face a very, very interesting dilemma. Back in the day, in the early 1950s, late 1940s, when newcomers came from all over the world, Ben Gurion had to decide what would be the glue that will keep them together. What will be the glue that will keep the newcomer from Yemen and the newcomer from Poland together? And he came up with the idea of a unique blend of Israelisms. We call this Israeli constitutionalism. The center of it is the attempt to create the new Jew. The new Jew who has a special relationship with earth, with agriculture, with the land, with crops. The new Jew that has a special relationships with his ability or her ability to defend themselves. At the center of it was the negation of the diaspora, and a new national ethos was developed. It was around resilience at first, and then when the news came from Europe about what was happening to the Jews of Europe, it evolved into a national ethos called Never Again. The IDF was at the center. The IDF was a ticket to enter Israeli society. If you served in the military, you were judged by the kind of contribution you made to society through your military service. Even the Jewish holiday under Ben Gurion's constitutionalism received a new meaning. For example, the holiday of Shavuos, from the giving of the Torah holiday to a celebration of the harvest. He changed the meaning of many other holidays. Of course, he didn't do it himself. He did it with others. So Israeli constitutionalism was under threat. The Knesset was attacked. Especially the court system was attacked. The institution of the Attorney General was attacked. The police was attacked. The civil service was attacked. There was no budget. The media was attacked. So Israelis felt that this onslaught on Israeli constitutionalism was too much. And the result is the 36th government of Israel. It's an 8-party coalition. 9 females, the first LGBTQ head of party, the first Islamist party as part of this coalition, which I can't even begin to tell you how dramatic it is. What keeps them together is this invisible interdependence. What brings together the 8 heads of those parties? Yair Lapid, who's really the mastermind of this coalition. Avigdor Lieberman, who's now the Minister of Finance. Gideon Sa'ar, who's now the Minister of Justice. Naftali Bennett, who's now the Prime Minister. Merav Michaeli, who's now the Minister of Transportation. Mansour Abbas, who's the leader of the Arab Party that joined the coalition. Nitzan Horowitz, who's the Minister of Health. And Benny Gantz, who's the Minister of Defense. All those 8 people, the highly unlikely coalition that you can imagine. What brings together Lieberman with Abbas? Nothing. Other than the animosity towards Netanyahu. What really keeps them together is the fact that none of them wants to see Netanyahu back. So, strangely enough, what keeps this coalition intact is the fact that Netanyahu sticks around. His decision not to step aside, not to retire, is the main reason for this coalition to survive. Now, when you look at Netanyahu's last 12 years, you can see clearly there's a huge difference between areas of progress and areas where no progress was achieved. Areas of progress include the international standing, we'll talk about it today, the economy, where definitely Netanyahu deserves credit. But no progress, sadly, was achieved on the issue of blocking Iran's nuclear aspirations, on the issue of the non-state actors that Israel is dealing with, namely 2 actors, Hamas from the south, Hezbollah from the north. Both of them are stronger than ever. They amassed a tremendous amount of precision weapons, especially missiles. And of course, when you look at the ranking of Israel as opposed to its fellow members of the OECD is the elite club of the world's strongest economies. Israel is part of that club. It's been part of that club since 2010. when you compare Israel's performance to the standard of the OECD, Israel is not doing well. Actually, Israel is deteriorating. The three trademarks of Netanyahu's style, the fact that he's risk averse, the fact that he masters the art of setting the agenda, and he masters the art of communicating using social media, worked in his favor but also worked against him at one point. Because at the end of the day, good governance is about the ability to find a balance between risks and opportunities. When you're all about opportunities, there's a danger that you see only the good stuff and you ignore the risks, and that could be reckless. When you're only about risks and you don't see the opportunities, that could lead to stagnation and paralysis, and that was the feeling of many Israelis. The importance of national ethos is critical to the understanding of what is happening in Israel, in Iran, and Afghanistan today. National ethos, if I had to describe it in one very simple sentence, is the collective story we tell ourselves about ourselves. Right? It reflects the shared values and traditions through which a nation views its past, present, and future. It is the integrating element that defines a nation's identity and bonds it into a coherent social group. That's the power of national ethos. So, for example, in the case of the United States, the national ethos, of course, is the American dream that says more or less, if you're willing to work hard, if you're willing to be a law-abiding citizen, then the sky's the limit. The state will provide you with all the opportunities that you need. No wonder the United States was referred to in literature as the land of opportunity. Now, of course, not every person has access to the opportunity, but the fact that this possibility exists is like an oil to the engine of American society, of American economy. In Israel's case, as we mentioned before, the national ethos is never again. It's all about resilience. Israel is a nation haunted by its past, haunted by what happened to the Jews of Europe, haunted by what happened even before the Holocaust. And the state of Israel was designed to provide a solution to the problem of Jewish existence in the diaspora. Now, of course, we can argue whether this has been a successful attempt or not, but one thing for sure, Zionism has never been stronger. State of Israel has never been stronger, has never been bigger. This Rosh Hashanah, we celebrated 9.4 million people. Now, you have to understand, I was born in 1962. There were 2.5 million Israelis. When I was 11 years old, the Yom Kippur War broke out. There were 3.3 million Israelis. Today, I'm 59 years old. There are 9.4 million Israelis. And we're being told that by 2048, when the State of Israel will celebrate 100 years, we will be 18 million people. So the population is going to double itself. So Israel's main issue in the region, given the fact that the intensity of the conventional military threat has dramatically declined, is Iran's nuclear aspiration. We cannot understand Iran's nuclear aspirations without understanding the Iranian national ethos. The Iranian national ethos has a lot to do with their past, with their own self-perception of a regional global superpower, as a regional global empire. You have to understand the Iranian mindset. There are 1.4 billion Muslims in the world. The vast majority of them are Sunnis. There are only 15% of those 1.4 billion Muslims who are Shiites. Of those 15%, the vast majority, about 75%, live in Iran. So Iran is the largest Shiite country in the world. Number 2 is Azerbaijan, by the way, their neighbor, and they're not getting along. But Iran sees itself, unlike what we may think, as a country fighting for its place within the world of Islam. Now, Iran's nuclear program started, many of you may be surprised to hear that, but it really started under the Shah with the help of the US government and reflected that national ethos of the claim to go back to the position of global power. Now, Iran's national identity plays a critical role in their leaders' historical dream to pursue those nuclear aspirations, those nuclear weapons, and again, restore its position as a global power. What are the priorities of the Iranians? So as I said before, number one priority is the Islamic world. The second priority is regional hegemony. And in that area, they're looking at several countries grabbing most of their attention. Number one, of course, is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. But you'll be surprised, Turkey is a big issue for the Iranians. And of course, Afghanistan under Taliban. Afghanistan is predominantly Sunni. So here's the connection. We'll talk about Afghanistan in a second. The third priority is Iran versus the West, meaning the exportation of the Islamic revolution. They even have a ministry called the Ministry for the Exportation of the Islamic Revolution, its values. They see their job as destabilizing regimes throughout the region, as well as in other parts of the world like North Africa. Even in Latin America, you can find their footprints and their fingerprints. And within that, of course, the opposition to what United States represents, and of course what Israel represents. So as you can see, Israel certainly does not top the agenda of the Iranians. We are on the agenda, but we're not on top of the agenda. What was the problem with Israel's policies vis-a-vis Iran under Netanyahu? You see, Iran has always been an issue for Israeli prime ministers. I remember Yitzhak Rabin was raising the issue of Iran with Bill Clinton in the early 1990s. And I can assure you there was no prime minister, there was no Israeli leader that did not bring up the issue of Iran with the United States, with Russia, with the European Union, with China over the years. The problem with Netanyahu's Iran policy was that style was overriding substance. What does it mean? Iran was always on the agenda as a quiet agenda item. The Iranian issue was discussed behind closed doors. In the case of Netanyahu, his approach to this issue was unique. It wasn't so much about the substance. It wasn't so much about the what. It was more about the how. And Netanyahu, shortly, in essence, turned the Iran issue into a public issue, into a public affairs issue, into something that you rally around publicly. And that did several things, probably as part of this, I'm a great believer in the theory of unintended consequence. The first thing that it did, it drew attention to Israel. It created the misperception as if Iran's nuclear aspirations is primarily Israel's problem, which is not the case. It's primarily the international community's problem. Believe it or not, the Europeans should be more concerned than Israel with Iran's nuclear aspirations. And it created the misperception that Israel was going to act on it. And of course, it gave other countries, especially again Europeans, the opportunity to say, you know what? You're talking about it so much, you care about it so much, you claim that you have the capacity to inflict harm on it, you get the job done. And I can't even begin to tell you how many screenwriters in Hollywood were already preparing the script for the Israeli raid on the Iranian nuclear program, the Iranian nuclear facilities, and so on. But the second mistake under Netanyahu, which is a dramatic mistake, was that under Netanyahu's leadership, Israel positioned itself not only as an actor that has the military solution, But Israel positioned itself as an actor who doesn't want to play with the team. Meaning, Israel voluntarily gave up on the opportunity to influence the Iran conversation. Israel voluntarily deserted diplomacy, which is something that is simply not done in international relations. The results are very sad. Iran has never been closer to nuclear military capabilities. If in 2009, when Netanyahu returned to his office as prime minister, they had only several tens of kilos of enriched uranium, today we're talking about 3.5 tons of enriched uranium, and some people project that they will reach the level of 5 tons of enriched uranium very, very soon. Now, as I said before, what happened in Afghanistan, the American pullout from Afghanistan, is not necessarily good news for Iran. And for that, we have to discuss a little bit what brought America to Afghanistan and what took America out of Afghanistan. In 1831, French political theorist and political scientist by the name of Alexis de Tocqueville, many of you know who he is, traveled the United States, and he wrote a book about the American democracy in which he predicted that the United States will become a global superpower. He used the term exceptional to describe the fundamentals of the American system. Basically, American exceptionalism is the belief that the United States has unique set of values such as freedom and basic liberties that make the country destined and entitled to play a distinct and positive role on the world stage. And this is exactly what happened, especially if you look at the history and the annals of the 20th century. The United States played a hugely significant role in liberating Europe twice. And of course, when the United States came into Afghanistan, that was the idea. The idea was that here we are coming to Afghanistan to bring our values, to help you build a nation, not only to help get rid of Al-Qaeda cells and radical Islam. But here's the problem. When the United States came into Afghanistan, there was no consideration of the highly complex makeup of Afghani society. The idea of nation state in Afghanistan, as much as in other parts of the Middle East, was imposed on those nations. These are not organic nations. You look at Iraq, you look at Afghanistan, these are not organic nations. There are tens of different ethnic groups. There are tens of different tribal conflicts and tensions. And at the end of the day, the loyalty of the Afghanis goes first to their clan and to their tribe. And this must be understood. So when we accuse the Afghanis, we say to them, look, we came to you 20 years ago, we provided you with arms, we provided you with training, we were hoping that you will create a strong national army, and then once we leave, you are being defeated so shamefully by Taliban, is not an accurate depiction of what actually happened. It's not that the Afghanis do not know how to fight. If there's one thing they do know, is how to fight. It's that the Afghanis never had a reason to fight because they don't see the nation state along the same lines we do. Their loyalty is not to their nation. Their loyalty is to their tribe, is to their clan, is to their families. That's exactly what happened in Iraq. Iraq, same thing, was not an organic country. So, interestingly enough, the same exceptionalism, American exceptionalism, that brought the United States into the region to build nations, to introduce democracy, the same idea is actually the main reason for them to pull out of Afghanistan, realizing 20 years after entering Afghanistan that this mission cannot be completed. A few words about what is going to happen with Israeli coalition. I was asked about what will the Israeli coalition do when it comes to the Palestinian issue, when it comes to the settlements, when it comes to all the pending issues between Israelis and Palestinians. Some of you may have heard that we had a pretty dramatic event here. A group of Islamic Jihad prisoners was able to escape prison in a very daring operation. They were not captured yet, but many observers claim that this is a great opportunity for both the Israelis and the Palestinians to put on the table the need to begin direct engagement again. Given the makeup of the coalition, given the fact that the coalition cannot really produce groundbreaking decisions on geopolitical issues, it would be safe to assume that the priority will go to domestic agenda issues, such as what I mentioned before: budget. The healthcare system needs serious rehabilitation. We have to deal with some major social rifts, especially Haredis and Arabs. We just had riots here only a few months ago, where Jews were rioting against Arabs and Arabs were rioting against Jews. We had lynching events on both sides. Arabs were lynching Jews and Jews were lynching Arabs. Of course, they will give priority to the rehabilitation of the trust in Israel's legal system and the trust of the Israelis in their Knesset representatives. And perhaps the most pressing matter is governance, the ability to control the country, the ability to manage the country. In that respect, Naftali Bennett is doing something very, very impressive when he decided to present a new approach to the way his government is going to deal with the COVID-19 crisis by saying we have to learn to live with the virus. Lockdowns are not a long-term sustainable solution, and this is not something that we're going to do. He pushed for the third booster shot. About 80% of eligible people already received the shot in Israel. And it looks now that he was able to curb the fourth wave of COVID-19 breakthrough cases in Israel. So this government is going to put a clear emphasis on domestic agenda, on infrastructure issues, for example. Those are the areas where the government can prove results and show quick gains. On the Palestinian issue, there's a very interesting phenomenon. If you ask most Israelis, they'll tell you that the preferred solution is the two-state solution. They'll tell you it's the only viable solution on the table. The so-called one-state solution doesn't really exist because it means the end of the Zionist enterprise. But if you would ask them at the same time, what do you think is the feasibility or the probability of the two-state solution actually taking place, the vast majority of Israelis will tell you it's not going to happen. And the big question is why? The answer is very simple. For many, many years, the Israelis were led to believe that the conflict was about land. That in fact what the Palestinians want is their piece of land. They want independence. They want to have what we call self-determination. They want to have what we call self-rule. They want to run their own lives. And once you'll give them that, you'll get what you want, which is peace and security. So at the core was a territorial compromise, which indeed was the name of a very viable, very vibrant Israeli political camp called the Territorial Compromise Camp. That's the camp that brought Yitzhak Rabin to power. That's the camp that brought Ehud Barak to power in 1999. But then several things happened that shaken the belief that really territory is at the core of the bargain. The first was the decline of the Bill Clinton plan in 2000. Israel said yes to a far-reaching territorial compromise proposed by Bill Clinton. Arafat said no, and shortly thereafter waged war against Israeli civilians. 72% of Israel's fatalities were civilians, not soldiers, not police officers, civilians. This was an onslaught against Israeli civilian society. Then the second thing that happened in the summer of 2005, Israel was pulling out of Gaza, Ariel Sharon's government. basically giving Gaza to the Palestinians until the last square inch, instead of turning Gaza into an oasis. What the Palestinians did, I don't have to tell you, turned Gaza into a hotbed of terrorism, into a launching pad of repeated attacks against Israelis. Tens of thousands of rockets were shelled onto Israel from Gaza since the summer of 2005 until today. And lastly, 2008, Ehud Olmert is making a proposal, again, a territorial compromise proposal. 100% of the land that you demand, he says to the Palestinians, will be given to you. Just sign the agreement, and the Palestinians declined to accept Olmert's proposal. For whatever reason, the Palestinians have their own reasons. We can analyze them on a different occasion. But the fact of the matter is that the Israelis lost faith in the principle that territory is at the core of the conflict. In other words, it's not the 1967 Six-Day War that is the unfinished business between Israelis and Palestinians, but actually the 1948 war, which was over our very right to exist. So a series of Palestinian inactions led the average Israeli to believe that what we're looking at here is actually a far more existential issue of whether the Arabs are willing to accept our right to exist in peace and security. And when you look at the history of what happened to the Zionist enterprise since the first neighborhood was built outside of the old city in 1860 by Sir Moses Montefiore, Yemin Moshe, from 1860 until today, one can look at it as one long onslaught against Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. And today, my friends, this is the prevailing view among Israelis. That's how you end up with this very peculiar position where most Israelis support the two-state solution, but at the same time claim it's not going to happen. On the issue of settlements, I was asked specifically to address the issue of settlements. The same thing. Israel proved time and again with Egypt, with the Palestinians, with the pull out from Gaza. It wasn't only pulling out from Gaza. Israel also demolished several settlements up in the West Bank near the city of Jenin, but also in the peace agreement with the Jordanian. Israel proved time and again that settlements is not going to be the obstacle to peace. And yet, the Palestinians are making it look like it's the number one obstacle to peace. I can tell you, during the Camp David summit in the summer of the year 2000, although no written agreement was produced as a result of the summit, but there was one very, very clear understanding between Israelis and Palestinians, and that is that settlements is not going to be the obstacle. At the end of the day, we look at it as an area in dispute, which is another very, very important update for you to understand the difference between the way the Israelis look at it and the rest of the world is looking at it. The areas taken over by the Israelis were never under Palestinian control. So when Mahmoud Abbas claims that Israel should return the sovereignty over the eastern part of Jerusalem to the Palestinians, or Israel should return the sovereignty over the West Bank to the Palestinians, the Israelis' answer to that is, you never had it. What do you mean return to the Palestinians? Jerusalem was under many rulers have ruled Jerusalem over the years. The Palestinians never did. It was the Jordanians from 49 to 67. Before that, it was the British mandate. Before that was the Turkish, the Mamluks, and it goes all the way to the early days of Jewish history. So the answer that Israelis have on this issue is that the area is disputed. And the only way to settle the dispute is through direct negotiations. Let's talk and find a solution. And as long as this is not happening, I don't see how we're going to end this conflict. When it comes to the geopolitical arena, the situation is a bit more complicated. This government will not be able to move forward quickly with the Palestinians, although we must say the Palestinians under the leadership of Mahmoud Abbas, known as Abu Mazen, they are not getting enough credit for collaborating with Israelis on security issues and primarily for committing themselves to nonviolence. I don't know if you know that, but Mahmoud Abbas is the first Palestinian leader in the history of the Palestinian national movement. It's certainly different than Arafat, who committed himself and his movement to nonviolence. He does not believe in terrorism, although what he does with the so-called shaheeds is very, very problematic. There's a stipend system that provides financial support to families of suicide bombers and others that went on to kill Jews. It's very disturbing, but he himself does not support military opposition as a solution. He believes in negotiations, although he's been very, very reluctant to move forward in negotiations. But when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, please do not expect any breakthrough from this government. It's not going to happen. What this government will probably do is spend more time and energy on improving the economic ties between Israel and the West Bank, possibly between Israel and the Gaza Strip. With the normalization with the Arab countries, I'm assuming that things will continue to go well. At least this is what this is the vibe we're getting from our friends in the Gulf countries. And of course, the big breakthrough will be signing a normalization agreement with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which I believe is something that is certainly feasible, can be done with the help of the U.S. administration and so on. Another big issue for this government to deal with is the relations with Turkey. Turkey seems to be interested in resuming the warm ties that it used to have with Israel. There was a phone call between the Turkish president and Israeli president, Isaac Herzog, and many commentators see in this a very, very positive development. As I mentioned before, another great factor is the fact that there is a decline in the intensity and the magnitude of conventional threats Israel is facing, especially when you're considering the disintegration of Syria. And at the same time, there's an unprecedented level of intimacy between Israel and the world's greatest powers. So it's not only the United States, it's also India, it's China, it's Russia, it's Brazil, it's Nigeria, and other countries. The most important thing to know about Israel going forward is that not only that we are projected to massively grow, double the population in the next 30 years, but also that Israel was able to overcome some of the most strategic defining issues. For example, lack of water. Israel today is fully independent when it comes to water production, energy independence, the ability to create a knowledge-based economy, which is highly resilient. It can really storm safely through the weathers of economic meltdowns as it happened in 2008, 2009. And when you consider Israeli creativity today, it's not only in high-tech, it's in lifestyle and leisure, it's in arts and culture, it's in healthcare, it's even in the way we defend ourselves. So there are many, many reasons for all of us to be highly optimistic on this Rosh Hashanah after the high holidays, because we are looking at a bright future. I personally believe that Israel is only at the beginning of the takeoff. Israel is only at the beginning of a tremendous breakthrough in culture, in economy, in society, and hopefully also in politics. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much for your friendship, and I wish all of you Gmar Chatima Tova. God bless you all, and greetings from Jerusalem.